Somewhere in a frozen cave system in the Caucasus Mountains, scientists extracted DNA from a skeleton buried for over 30,000 years, and inside that ancient genetic code, they found something that shouldn't have existed yet, according to everything we thought we understood about the origins of red hair. Because for decades, the story taught in classrooms and repeated in documentaries was simple. Red hair was a Celtic trait, an Irish trait, a Scottish trait, born somewhere in the misty hills of the British Isles a few thousand years ago. That story is not just incomplete. It is, according to the genetic record, almost entirely wrong. The real origin of red hair begins tens of thousands of years earlier, in a place far from Ireland, and it involves not one mutation, but a strange collision of separate genetic accidents that occurred in different populations, on different continents, at different points in deep human history, all converging on the same visible result. It is one of the most misunderstood stories in all of human genetics, and untangling it means rewriting almost everything the popular imagination believes about where redheads actually come from. To understand how strange this story really is, you first need to understand what red hair actually is at the molecular level, because it is not, in the simplest sense, a color that was added. It is a color that emerges when something else is switched off. The gene responsible sits on chromosome 16 and D is called MC1R, short for melanocortin-1 receptor. In most humans, this gene acts like a dimmer switch controlling which type of pigment your body produces. When MC1R functions normally, it signals skin and hair cells to produce eumelanin, the dark brown and black pigment that dominates human hair color worldwide. But when specific mutations disrupt this receptor, the body defaults to a different pigment entirely, a reddish-yellow compound called pheomelanin. Red hair is not really about producing something new. It is about losing the ability to suppress something that was always chemically present, waiting beneath the surface. Here's where the story becomes genuinely strange, because scientists have now identified more than 80 distinct variants of the MC1R gene, and at least a handful of them, when inherited in the right combinations, are capable of producing red hair independently of one another. This means red hair was not invented once, in one place, by one lucky mutation that then spread across the world. It appears to have emerged multiple times in different populations, through different mutational pathways, all arriving at a strikingly similar outcome. It is one of the clearest examples in human biology of what scientists call convergent mutation, separate genetic accidents converging on the same visible trait, almost as if evolution kept stumbling onto the same trick from different directions. And the oldest of these red hair variants is not associated with modern humans at all. It comes from something far older, far stranger, and far more controversial. In 2007, researchers extracting ancient DNA from Neanderthal remains found in Spain. In Italy, discovered a variant of the MC1R gene that was completely distinct from any red hair mutation found in modern human populations. Now, when this variant was reconstructed and its function tested in laboratory conditions, the results were remarkable. It reduced melanin production in a way strikingly similar to the mutations that cause red hair in humans today. In other words, at least some Neanderthals likely had red or reddish hair tens of thousands of years before Homo sapiens carried the trait into Europe. The Neanderthal mutation and the modern human mutation are not the same genetic change. They arose independently in two separate branches of the human family tree that had already diverged hundreds of thousands of years earlier. Nature, it seems, found the same door twice through two completely different hallways. This discovery forced anthropologists to reconsider a species that popular culture had flattened into a caricature of primitive, grunting cave dwellers. A red-haired Neanderthal, pale-skinned, freckled, walking through the Ice Age forests of what is now Croatia or northern Spain, complicates the tidy narrative in ways that make some researchers deeply uncomfortable and others deeply fascinated. It raises an unsettling question that most documentaries avoid asking directly. When modern humans expanded into Europe and encountered Neanderthal populations, and we now know with certainty that the two groups interbred. Did any of that ancient, independently evolved red pigment gene pass into the modern human bloodline? The honest answer, based on current genetic evidence, is almost certainly not directly, since the specific Neanderthal MC1R variant has not been found segregating in living human populations. But the fact that the question can even be asked, that two separate species independently rolled the genetic dice and landed on nearly the same result, tells us something profound about how fragile and repeatable the biology of human pigmentation really is. So if red hair in modern humans did not come from Neanderthals directly, where did it actually originate? The genetic trail leads, again, away from where popular imagination expects it to lead. The specific MC1R mutations most associated with red hair in modern Homo sapiens populations show their oldest and deepest signatures not in Ireland or Scotland, but in populations stretching across a much wider ancient range, from the eastern edges of Europe through the Caucasus and into parts of Central Asia. Some population geneticists studying the distribution and age of these mutations have proposed that certain red hair variants may be tens of thousands of years old, potentially predating the agricultural revolution entirely, which would place their origin among hunter-gatherer populations, who were adapting, generation by generation, to environments with dramatically reduced sunlight compared to the regions their distant ancestors had come from. This connects red hair to one of the most important and underappreciated forces in human evolutionary history, the slow, brutal recalibration of human skin as populations moved further from the equator. Melanin is not simply a matter of appearance. It is a biological shield, evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in Africa to protect skin from intense ultraviolet radiation. But that same shield becomes a liability in northern latitudes, where sunlight is scarce for much of the year, and the body's ability to synthesize vitamin D through the skin depends on UV exposure actually reaching living tissue. Populations that migrated into low sunlight environments faced a genuine survival pressure to lighten their skin, and mutations that disrupted melanin production, including certain MC1R variants, would have offered a real measurable advantage in these conditions, even though the more visible side effect was hair and skin coloring that stood out dramatically against darker-haired neighbors. This is likely why red hair, unlike some other pigmentation traits, seems to have been positively selected for in certain ancient northern populations, rather than simply drifting into existence by chance. A 2014 study analyzing ancient skeletal remains from across Eurasia found evidence consistent with selective pressure acting on pigmentation genes as early human populations pushed into higher latitudes following the retreat of the ice sheets roughly 12,000 years ago. The same evolutionary logic that produced blue eyes and pale skin across parts of Europe and Central Asia appears to have also nudged red hair mutations toward higher frequency in specific isolated populations, wherever genetic drift and environmental pressure happen to intersect. But the geography of ancient red hair carries a twist that very few documentaries acknowledge, because some of the oldest and most striking archaeological evidence connected to red-haired populations does not come from Europe at all. It comes from the same desert basin in western China that has become one of the most important sites in the entire field of ancient DNA research, the Tarim Basin, home to a collection of astonishingly well-preserved mummies dating back roughly 4,000 years, some of them naturally desiccated by the arid desert. Climate to the point where hair color, texture, and even eyelashes remain visible today. Several of these mummies display reddish OR auburn hair. An initial genetic analysis conducted in the early 2000s sparked wild speculation, including theories connecting them to Celtic migration across the entirety of Asia, a theory that captured public imagination for years despite thin evidence. When more rigorous ancient DNA sequencing was finally conducted on these remains in 2021, the actual findings were, in a strange way, even more remarkable than the Celtic migration myth they replaced. The Tarim mummies were not recent arrivals from anywhere. Genetic analysis revealed they descended from a deeply isolated population, one that had split off from other ancient North Eurasian groups tens of thousands of years earlier, and then remained genetically isolated with minimal external admixture, FOR, an extraordinarily long period before eventually settling in the Tarim Basin. They were not Celts, who wandered improbably across the entire Asian continent. They were something arguably more interesting. A genetically ancient population that had been quietly persisting at the edges of human memory, carrying pigmentation traits, including reddish hair, that trace back to the same deep well of ancient Eurasian ancestry that also gave rise to red-haired lineages appearing later in Europe. This detail matters enormously because it suggests that red hair, much like blue eyes, was not born in a single European homeland and then exported outward through later migration. It appears to have existed, in scattered and independent pockets, across a vast and ancient genetic landscape stretching from Western Europe through the steppes of Central Asia and into the deserts of Western China, long before the modern political and cultural boundaries that we use to mentally sort human populations even existed. And this raises a question almost nobody asks, because it cuts against a deeply ingrained cultural assumption. If ancient red hair variants were distributed across such a wide ancient range, why does red hair appear today with such overwhelming concentration specifically in Ireland and Scotland, where roughly 10 to 13% of the population carries the trait far higher than almost anywhere else on Earth? The answer lies not in where the mutation originated, but in what happened to the populations that carried it afterward. And this is where the story becomes less about deep ancestry and more about the brutal mathematics of small, isolated populations. Ireland and Scotland, particularly in their more remote and mountainous regions, experienced repeated waves of relative genetic isolation throughout prehistory and into the historical period. Smaller founding, a trait that exists at low frequency in a large ancestral population, can become dramatically more common in a smaller, isolated, descendant population purely through the random mathematics of who happens to have children with whom. Generation after generation. In a limited genetic pool, red hair did not become common in Ireland because Ireland invented it. It became common because Ireland, in certain regions, became one of the places where the ancient mutation, once introduced through Bronze Age and Iron. This process connects to a broader and genuinely fascinating pattern that ancient DNA research has revealed about the peopling of the British Isles, because the genetic ancestry of modern Irish and Scottish populations is itself a layered archaeological record, built from at least 3 major waves of migration. The earliest layer comes from Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who arrived after the retreat of the ice sheets, dark-skinned and blue-eyed according to reconstructed ancient remains, a combination that surprises. There is something almost poetic about this detail, because it means the two populations most stereotypically associated with red hair in the modern world, and the ancient nomadic herders of the Central Asian steppe, whose descendants also carry genetic variants toward the Tarim Basin thousands of kilometers to the east, are connected through the same deep ancestral migration network. The fiery-haired Irish farmer and the desert-buried Tarim mummy are, in a genuine genetic sense, distant cousins, shaped by branches of the same ancient population that fractured and scattered across an entire continent, carrying fragments of the same pigmentation mutations to opposite ends of Eurasia. There's another layer to this story that adds a genuinely unsettling dimension, because the same MC1R mutations responsible for red hair are also linked, through documented clinical research, to differences in pain perception. Multiple studies conducted over the past 2 decades have found that individuals carrying 2 copies of specific red hair-associated MC1R variants show measurably different sensitivity to certain types of pain, and require, on average, notably higher doses of certain anesthetics to achieve the same effect compared to individuals without the variant. The mechanism appears to involve the same receptor pathway responsible for pigmentation, also playing an unexpected secondary role in pain signaling within the central nervous system, an evolutionary quirk that likely has nothing to do with any adaptive purpose and everything to do with systems over evolutionary time. It is a striking reminder that a single genetic switch, flipped tens of thousands of years ago somewhere on the ancient Eurasian steppe, still quietly shapes something as intimate and clinical as how a modern redhead's body responds to a dentist's needle today. Cultural history adds yet another dimension to this genetic puzzle, because throughout much of recorded human history, red hair occupied a strange and often contradictory symbolic space, precisely because of its statistical rarity. In ancient Egypt, red hair was associated with the god Set, linked to chaos and the desert, and red-haired individuals were reportedly viewed with suspicion in certain periods. In medieval and early modern Europe, red hair became entangled with accusations of witchcraft during periods of intense superstition, a grim intersection of genetic rarity and social persecution that likely cost real lives. Yet, in other contexts and time periods, red hair carried associations of nobility, fierceness, and even divine favor, particularly connected to certain royal and aristocratic lineages across medieval Europe. The genetic rarity that made red hair biologically unremarkable in the grand mechanics of evolution made it culturally remarkable in nearly every society that encountered it. A pattern that repeats across wildly different civilizations that had no contact with one another, suggesting something almost universal in how human societies respond to visible genetic outliers within their own populations. Modern population genetics has continued to refine this picture in ways that keep producing new surprises. A large-scale genetic study published in 2018, analyzing data from hundreds of thousands of participants, identified additional gene variants beyond MC1R that contributed to red hair in ways previously unrecognized, suggesting the genetic architecture behind. This single visible trait is more complex than scientists assumed even a decade earlier. Researchers have also found that red hair frequency, while highest in Ireland and Scotland, appears at meaningfully elevated rates in unexpected pockets across the world, including certain populations in North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of the Pacific, islands, where local traditions sometimes involve lime-based hair treatments that chemically lighten hair color, complicating efforts to distinguish genetic red hair from culturally induced coloring, a reminder that biology and culture are never as cleanly separable as researchers might prefer. What emerges from all of this is a story considerably richer and stranger than the simple, tidy narrative of an Irish or Scottish trait born in the misty hills of the British Isles. Red hair is, in the deepest sense, a story about repetition, about the same rare genetic accident occurring independently across separate branches of the human family tree, in Neanderthals tens of thousands of years before modern humans ever set foot in Europe. In ancient hunter-gatherer populations adapting to the brutal, light-starved winters of the north, in nomadic herders whose descendants scattered fragments of shared ancestry from the Atlantic coast of Ireland to the deserts of western China. It is a trait that emerged no T once, but many times, through many separate genetic doors, each time landing on a nearly identical result, as if the underlying architecture of human pigmentation only has so many possible failure points. And evolution across hundreds of thousands of years and multiple species kept finding its way back to the same ones. And perhaps that is the detail worth sitting with longest, because it reframes what a rare trait like red hair actually represents. It is not evidence of a single isolated tribe, untouched by the currents of history preserving something pure and unchanged. It is the opposite. It is a scar tissue of deep time, visible proof of just how many separate populations, how many independent migrations, how many isolated valleys and desert basins and windswept coastlines were involved in assembling the genetic inheritance carried by a single modern red-headed child born today in Dublin or Tehran or a village outside Almaty. Every strand of that child's hair carries an argument that has been running quietly through the human genome for tens of thousands of years. Proof that the boundaries we draw between peoples and nations and ethnicities are almost always far younger, far shallower, and far more artificial than the deep biological threads connecting us underneath them. The color of a single strand of hair, it turns out, is capable of holding an entire hidden map of human wandering, written not in ink, but in the oldest language our species has ever spoken, the quiet, patient language of DNA.